Good morning and welcome to our Satsang, to all those here and to those that are watching via the internet. This reading is from Whispers from Eternity by Paramahansa Yogananda, entitled Flood Me with Thy Omnipresent Love. O Fountain of Love, flood the lowlands of our love for home and family with Thy omnipresent love. O mighty source of all our rivers of desire, teach us not to cut ourselves off from Thee, hunting on dry sands of sense satisfaction. Love is our soul's birthright. We demand now that all the rivers of our cravings be redirected through valleys of humility, eager self-sacrifice, and concern for others until, reinforced by Thy torrential blessings, they merge in the ocean of all fulfillment in Thee. Bless us that the rivulets of our sympathy, affection, and love lose not themselves in the sands of dreary selfishness. Blessed the little, lonely, separately moving streamlets of our love, which come from Thee, merge at last in the vastness of Thy perfect love. And from the New Path by Swami Kriyananda, the reading that I selected today is from part 1 of the Path, and this is before he met Yogananda himself. And he was going through a titanic struggle because in the late 40s, here we're spoiled because many decades have passed and yoga, meditation is so well known. But in the late 40s, it was not. And he really almost came to the brink where he thought he was going insane because he had never heard of anyone seeking God. All the churches he would go to and so forth, they were all watered down teachings. And when he would ask the different ministers and so forth for direction, they wouldn't know what to say when he asked these deep and penetrating questions. And so this particular chapter that I'm reading from is just prior to where he met Paramahansa Yogananda in 1948. So the title of the chapter is called He Gathers Strength for the Climb. At about this time in my life, I had an interesting dream. I was living with many other people in a torture chamber. For generations, our families had lived here, knowing no world but this one. The possibility of any other existence simply never occurred to us. One awoke, one was tortured, and at night, one found brief respite in sleep. What else could there be to life? We didn't particularly mind our lot. Rather, we imagined ourselves reasonably well off. Oh, to be sure, there were bad days, but then there were also good ones. Days together, sometimes when we were less tortured than usual. The time came, however, when a handful of us began to think the unthinkable. Might there, we asked ourselves, just possibly be another, a better way of life? Moments snatched when our torturers were out of earshot and we could share our doubts with a few friends served to kindle our speculations. At last, we determined that there simply had to be an alternative to be tortured. A small group of us decided to rebel. We laid our plans carefully. One day, rising together from our task, we slipped behind the torturers, slew them, and escaped. Sneaking cautiously out of the great room, fearing lest armies of torturers be lying in wait for us outside, we encountered no one. The torture chamber itself, it turned out, occupied only the top floor of a large, otherwise empty building. We walked unchallenged, down flights of stairs, emerging from the ground floor onto a vast, empty plain. Confined as we'd been our whole lives, in the torture chamber, the horizon seemed incredibly distant. Joyfully, we inhaled the fresh air, gazing about us We all but shouted the previously never imagined word, freedom. Before departing the building forever, we glanced up at the top floor, scene of the only life we'd ever known. There, to our astonishment, we saw the very tortures we thought we'd slain. They were going matter-of-factly about their business as though nothing had happened. Amazed, we looked to one another for an explanation. Suddenly, the answer dawned on me. "Don't you see?" I exclaimed. "It's ourself we have conquered, not the torturers." With that realization, I woke. Though I didn't realize it at the time, my ignorance concerning the spiritual path was my own chief torture. It hindered me from seeking the good for which my soul longed. Had I approached truth by love, I might have gone straight to the mark. There's a very interesting story. I believe it's in Conversations of Yogananda, where there was a very learned professor that came to see Yogananda. I believe it was in Encinitas in Southern California. And so he wanted to ask these very, very complicated questions, and he did. And what was his shock and surprise when Yogananda simply said, "Love God." The man thought, well, maybe he's got a hearing issue or something. What is this? Maybe he had heard about saints being a little eccentric, and here was yet another one. So he thought, well, I'll try another. And so again, another complex question, born of his, what he thought, superior intellect. And again, Yogananda said, even more forcefully, "Love God." The man thought, oh my gosh, what is this? And so he asked yet another question. And then Yogananda really shocked him. Again, he almost shouted, "Love God." And then Yogananda abruptly got up from his seat and walked out of the room. And the man, as Swami Kriyananda said, many, many years ago, I believe he was a teacher in Chicago, would share from time to time the example of how eccentric these saints were, and sharing his story, not understanding, being clueless as to the great blessing that he was being given that could have penetrated the very heart of his being had he had the humility, had he had the receptivity at that time. Perhaps later in the incarnation he did wake up and reflect on that incredible experience and draw from it and grow spiritually. Yogananda, all of the great saints, they care not for all of these silly things that mankind is involved with. Yes, they participate in this world wholeheartedly, but nevertheless, they are completely focused on God, as Yogananda's chief woman disciple used to say, and it was her motto, God alone. And so in that way, we don't get caught up in all of these various tributaries that take us away from the heart. The spiritual path is really not all that difficult. If we have the basic understanding, it's about love God. And after a time, we stumble upon these great scriptures like in the Bible, which says, love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. How could that be interpreted in any other way? We begin to think, my gosh, what is this? Love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's going to take a mighty effort. But it needn't. If we simply monitor the mind more carefully, we're being tortured when we're not in our heart by our own self. And we're being tortured further if we don't take responsibility for our actions and for our undisciplined mind and for living in the senses and all the things that carry us away again and again and again. But if we will be childlike, as all of the scriptures share, then it won't be difficult. Reflect on when we were little. And we didn't have to think about balancing our checkbook and making sure that we paid the bills, otherwise they turn off the electricity, and on it goes. Our life was a simple life. It was a life where we could enjoy playing and all of that. And it was something truly to be savored. But as we grew older, and we looked in the mirror and we were no longer seeing the reflection of a 4-year-old or a 12-year-old, we were seeing someone, that looked mature. We thought, oh, now I've arrived. And if we didn't look out, we got landlocked in our own mind, taking ourselves too seriously, taking life too seriously, and not spending as much time as we should have in our own hearts. If we look at our early pictures when we were little, hopefully we see an open spirit, someone, a little being, a little elf, a little angel that just was running around having fun. And when we see children too, you see this wonderful example of innocence and simplicity. And that's what the saints are urging us to become once again. And though we inhabit now adult bodies, we can't be fooled by this experience, because really, when we get into the depths of our being, we have to acknowledge that we're just children. That's all. We're just children. And even the saints, as mighty as they are, with their omnipresent power, again and again you see these beautiful examples of their humility. We read about the relationship between Yogananda and Sri Yukteswar, and you see this incredible innocence and such sweetness that the Guru had, the Chela had for the Guru. And we think, now, this is an example for me. I want to be like that. I want to find ways that I can keep my life simple. There's a wonderful story of St. Francis and St. Clare. Yogananda's patron saint, interestingly, was St. Francis. And that's why we have a beautiful ashram. Go there, if you can, to Europe, to Italy. And the openness, the blessing, the heart quality that's in Italy is very deep, like here in India. And so in one particular time, St. Francis and St. Clare met in the forest. And upon their meeting, the various villagers were completely astonished when they saw in the forest this enormous, what appeared to be raging fire. And so what did they do? They got the various needed implements, shovels and so forth, ran to the fire. This was something quite alarming, to put it out. It wasn't that at all. It wasn't something physical. It was the love that was coming from these two saints. Imagine that experience. They put their shovels down and no doubt got upon their knees in worship for this deep blessing of a love that the saints don't often share in this tangible way, but for some reason it seemed that it was appropriate to really share a miracle. St. Francis and St. Clare shared a miracle with the local townspeople, that this love that they found, that they experienced inside, when expressed, looked like a raging fire that would burn down the forest. But it really was meant to burn down all of those desires and limitations and all the things that keep us bound to our egos. And so when we get ourselves off, which, if we were to count throughout the day how many times we fall mentally and emotionally and even sometimes physically, stubbing our toes and so forth, it's many times. Many times. We don't really need to count them up. Many times. But it's compounds the air if we identify with those setbacks as our own self, because that's not. It's just an experience we're having in this dream. But the lesson of these various challenges and of these things that have come to us both internally and externally is to make sure that we are in our center so that we can behave appropriately. Because otherwise, then our reactions, again, compound the problem. We get a slap from our karma in one way or another, manifested outwardly or inwardly, whatever it might be. And then we think, aha, for this time it's eye for an eye. I'm tired of turning the other cheek. My cheek is bruised from days of turning the other cheek. Now out comes my fist. It's war. And so on. Well, sometimes that's appropriate, but most often not. And so the yogi, the yogini, begins bit by bit to arrive at the point where they live in the spine, where they live in their center. And when things come that challenge us, the first thing we do is to take refuge in our hearts, to make sure that the heart is open so that the words that we speak and the things that we do are appropriate. That's why we love the saints. What they do is perfectly appropriate in every situation. There's this amazing, to drive this point home, there's this amazing experience that Swami Kriyananda had with Yogananda. They were watching a play, and I believe this story is in the Path. And this play, a bit of a musical, was being put on by a famed wrestler. But he also wanted to see if he could expand his skills into dance, but it didn't quite translate. And basically, his performance was ridiculous. And so Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda were there in the audience, and they were trying to suppress their laughter. And it was extremely difficult. They were having to use all their willpower. And tears were streaming down their cheek as they saw this outrageous spectacle. And then at one point, it was so bad and so embarrassing to the theater that hastily the stagehands brought the curtain, across the play. And the man was seen storming off, to give, whoever did that, a piece of his mind. And yet, when this man, very indignant, met with Yogananda afterwards, now, how could have we done in this situation? Would we still be drying our tears? Would our stomachs still hurt from the belly laughs? Yogananda, as is true of all the saints, in perfect control, when the man expressed, his outrage and how he had been treated, welcome, he completely sympathized. And there wasn't any feeling of the previous experience where he was laughing and almost unable to control with Swami his mirth. He was able right there. How could he do that? Because he was a saint of love. And he knew that the individual's reality was not of the highest order. And yet, he didn't mind that. That's fine. There was no problem. He was a child of God. And so he was hurting, and so he wanted to comfort him and say whatever words he did which were appropriate, which would give the man this feeling of encouragement that, perhaps his performance was good after all. It was the audience and others that didn't really appreciate the refinement of his art. Whatever it might have been that he carried away more than when he first arrived to talk to Yogananda, where he was in a state where he was shaken. And so, as we find ourselves able more and more to love God, and to love God in one another, and to take on the challenge, I believe it was from Teresa of Calcutta, or maybe Teresa of Avila, who said, "Can you love me in this disagreeable form?" In other words, when Christ comes to us, when God comes to us in whatever form, and they do, we not recognize that. when we find that someone comes to challenge us, can we love them in this disagreeable form? Because it is God, and because it is Christ there, because they're omnipresent. Could it be anyone else? And so, bit by bit, through really re-education, through doing our duty, by staying in Dharma, by staying especially in our hearts, we find that life becomes a real joy, because we find everything as raw material to keep our hearts open and to continue to expand our hearts so that we can begin to dream of being saints ourselves. That is something we need to hold near and dear to our hearts, because otherwise we're settling for less. And as children of God, that is an error. We need to settle for the heights. And so take the example of the love that the saints have. Read their stories and meditate on how they were able to behave in these very trying situations. Why? How? Because the love was there. That's why. When we're in love, we find then we're in a natural state. And we even surprise ourselves sometimes when someone comes to perhaps get our goat of peace, as Yogananda talked about. And we respond to them with love. I remember a time, some time ago, a few years back, when someone had acted, well, I don't want to emphasize it too much, but very badly. Very badly. And so I began, because I was involved in this experience personally, I began to pray for this person. And this has always been a habit of mine, because otherwise we can sit in judgment and this and that, and we don't want that. That shuts the heart down. It's the opposite of where we want to go. And so for some months I was praying for this person. I was really concentrating because there had been hurt, and I had suffered, and I didn't want to be in that state. And so Divine Mother, she really picked a very interesting experience for me. I went from Ananda Village to the nearby town of Grass Valley to do my laundry. And so I had done my laundry there many times, hardly ever met anybody there. I usually would go in the early morning. And so there was this individual facing me and actually staring me down. And I thought, wow. But because through God's grace, I had been pouring so much energy into him, I greeted him as a long-lost brother. And he was completely shocked by the experience. And it was absolutely genuine. I couldn't have done it myself. And we had a very sweet conversation. And how was he doing? I hadn't seen him. He had moved from the community and so on. And I don't know when he left the laundromat if he thought maybe I was, had a little bit too much to drink or whatever. I just don't know, because I'm sure it blew his mind. But I knew the truth. The truth is that I had worked very hard. Self-effort draws grace. I had worked very hard for this person who had tortured me. And I determined that I would keep my heart open, and it's open to him to this day. If I ever meet him again in the laundromat or somewhere, I feel that it would be very natural. And again, it would be something that would just come out. And so that's an extreme experience. I haven't had many like that. But they come from time to time. But the fact of the matter is that we have these opportunities where we really, really will do ourselves a great turn. And it will be a blessing for others if we extend ourselves with love. And so for all of us aspiring to the heights, this love and this joy we must have. We must demand of God and Guru. And it's a good thing. God's not going to get mad at us when we make these demands. We must demand that we have these basic spiritual qualities so that we can not only function, but we can really behave superconsciously. So, God bless you all, and thank you once again for coming.